January 897 AD. Inside the Basilica of St. John Lateran in Rome, cardinals and bishops gather for a papal trial. The accused sits on a throne, dressed in full papal robes. He does not speak in his own defense. He cannot. He has been dead for 9 months. His corpse was dug from the grave, dressed in sacred vestments, and propped up to face charges of crimes against God and the Church. What happened next would become one of the most grotesque spectacles in the history of the Catholic Church. To understand how the Catholic Church ended up putting a corpse on trial, you need to understand what historians call the Iron Age of the Papacy, a period of violence, corruption, and political chaos that consumed Rome in the late 9th and early 10th centuries. Between 872 and 965 AD, the papal throne changed hands 24 times. That's roughly one new pope per year. Between 896 and 904, just 9 years, there were 9 different popes. Being elected pope during this era was not an honor. It was a death sentence. Popes were strangled in prison, deposed by rivals, assassinated by noble families fighting for control of Rome. The position brought absolute power, but keeping that power long enough to die of natural causes was nearly impossible. This wasn't about faith. This was about control. Italy was fractured into warring factions. Noble families, particularly the Spoleto dynasty, used the papacy as a political weapon. Whoever controlled the pope controlled the ability to crown the Holy Roman Emperor, and whoever controlled that controlled much of Europe. Into this blood-stained chaos stepped a man named Formosus. Formosus was born around 816 AD into a Roman family. His name, ironically, means handsome in Latin. By all accounts, he was intelligent, ambitious, and politically shrewd, qualities that would both elevate him and ultimately destroy him. He rose through the church hierarchy quickly. In 864, Pope Nicholas I appointed him as Cardinal Bishop of Porto, a prestigious position just outside Rome. Formosus was sent on important diplomatic missions, including one to Bulgaria, where he successfully converted the Bulgarian king Boris I to Christianity, but his ambition made enemies. In 872, Pope John VIII accused Formosus of conspiring to seize the papacy for himself. The charge was serious. Coveting the papal throne was considered both a political crime and a sin against God. John VIII excommunicated Formosus and forced him to flee Rome. For years, Formosus lived in exile in France, his career seemingly over, but the political winds shifted. John VIII died, possibly poisoned, and the new Pope Marinus I lifted Formosus' excommunication in 883. Formosus returned to Rome and resumed his position as Bishop of Porto. Then, in October 891, something extraordinary happened. After the death of Pope Stephen V, the cardinals elected Formosus as the new pope. The man who had been excommunicated and exiled for allegedly coveting the papacy had just been handed the keys to the kingdom. But Formosus inherited a nightmare. Italy was controlled by Guy III of Spoleto, a ruthless warlord who had forced the previous pope to crown him Holy Roman Emperor. Guy's son, Lambert, was next in line. The Spoleto family expected Formosus to fall in line and recognize their authority. Formosus had other plans. He secretly reached out to Arnulf of Carinthia, the king of Germany, and invited him to invade Italy. Formosus wanted Arnulf to overthrow the Spolitans and take the imperial crown for himself. It was a dangerous gamble, and for a while it worked. Arnulf crossed the Alps with his forces in 894. Guy III died that same year, leaving his young son Lambert as emperor. Arnulf pressed his advantage, marching on Rome in 896. Formosus crowned him Holy Roman Emperor, hoping Arnulf would crush the Spoleto faction once and for all. But then Arnulf fell ill, possibly paralyzed by a stroke. His army withdrew. The invasion collapsed, and Formosus, having openly betrayed the Spolitans, was left vulnerable. On April 4th, 896, Pope Formosus died. He was buried with full papal honors in St. Peter's Basilica. His story should have ended there. It didn't. After Formosus's death, the Spoleto faction returned to power. Emperor Lambert and his mother, Angiltrud, marched back into Rome with their forces. They installed a new pope, Boniface VI, who died after just 2 weeks. Then came Stephen VI. Stephen had been made Bishop of Anagni by Formosus himself, possibly against his will. He owed his position to the dead pope, but Stephen was also deeply tied to the Spoleto family. Some historians believe Lambert and Angiltrud demanded Stephen take revenge on Formosus for his betrayal. Others believe Stephen acted out of personal rage, resentment, or political desperation. Whatever his motivation, Stephen VI made a decision that would shock even the violence-hardened clergy of medieval Rome. In January 897, 9 months after Formosus's burial, Stephen ordered his tomb opened. The corpse was exhumed. Decay had already set in. The body had been in the ground for the better part of a year. But Stephen's orders were clear. Dress the corpse in full papal vestments and bring it to Basilica of St. John Lateran. Formosus was about to stand trial. The event was meticulously organized. This wasn't a secret tribunal. It was a full synod, a formal ecclesiastical court. Cardinals, bishops, and clergy from across Rome were summoned to attend. They filled the basilica, forced to witness what was about to unfold. The corpse of Formosus was carried into the hall and propped up on the papal throne. His decomposing body sagged in the chair. Attendants positioned him upright, struggling to keep the dead pope from collapsing into a grotesque heap. A young deacon, likely in his teens, was appointed to serve as Formosus's defense attorney. Imagine being that deacon, or to speak on behalf of a rotting corpse, while the living pope screamed accusations from across the room. The trial began. Pope Stephen VI acted as prosecutor. He stood before the assembled clergy and hurled accusations at the silent, decaying figure on the throne. According to the chronicler Lateran of Cremona, Stephen shouted, "When you were Bishop of Porto, why did you usurp the universal Roman see in such a spirit of ambition?" The corpse, of course, said nothing. The teenage deacon stammered out a defense as best he could. But what could he say? The trial was a farce. The outcome had been decided before Formosus's body was ever pulled from the ground. Stephen accused Formosus of 3 primary crimes: perjury, lying under oath when he claimed he had not sought the papacy; illegally holding multiple bishoprics. Formosus had been Bishop of Porto when he became pope, which violated church canon law forbidding a bishop from transferring to a different diocese; coveting the papacy, the same charge that had gotten him excommunicated decades earlier. The trial dragged on. Stephen's rage intensified. Witnesses claim he screamed at the corpse, mocking it, insulting it, demanding answers it could never give. The clergy sat in stunned silence. Even in an age accustomed to brutality, this was beyond comprehension. Gavel striking, guilty verdict. Finally, the verdict was delivered. Formosus was found guilty on all charges. Pope Stephen VI declared that every act Formosus had performed as pope was null and void. Every ordination, every appointment, every consecration erased. Bishops and priests ordained by Formosus were told they would need to be reordained if they wanted to remain in the clergy. This wasn't just a condemnation of a dead man. It was an attack on the legitimacy of the church itself. Hundreds of clergy across Europe suddenly found their positions in question. But Stephen wasn't finished. He ordered Formosus's body stripped of its papal vestments. The sacred robes were torn away, replaced with rags. Then came the final indignity. Stephen had 3 fingers of Formosus's right hand cut off, the fingers the Pope used to give blessings. It was symbolic mutilation, a rejection of his spiritual authority even in death. The corpse was dragged out of Basilica and buried in a common graveyard reserved for foreigners and criminals. But even that wasn't enough for Stephen. Days later, he ordered the body dug up again and thrown into the Tiber River, the same river where ancient Romans had disposed of their most hated enemies for centuries. Formosus's body was cast into the water, left to rot and disappear. According to legend, a fisherman pulled Formosus's waterlogged corpse from the Tiber the next day. The body was secretly taken by sympathetic monks and hidden away. Rumors began to spread through Rome. People claimed the corpse was performing miracles, that sacred images of saints had bowed when Formosus's body passed by them. Whether these stories were true or propaganda doesn't matter. What mattered was the public reaction. The Cadaver Synod had gone too far. Even for a city used to political violence and papal intrigue, putting a corpse on trial, mutilating it, and throwing it in the river was obscene. Public outrage turned into riots. Mobs filled the streets of Rome. The clergy who had been forced to watch the spectacle turned against Stephen VI. Within months of the trial, Stephen VI was arrested. He was dragged from the Lateran palace and imprisoned. In July or August 897, just 6 months after the Cadaver Synod, Pope Stephen VI was strangled to death in his cell. His reign had lasted barely a year. Stephen's successor, Pope Theodore II, lasted only 20 days before dying. But in those 20 days, he convened a synod that annulled the Cadaver Synod and declared Formosus innocent. Formosus's body was retrieved and reburied in St. Peter's Basilica with full honors. The next pope, John IX, went even further. He held 2 synods, one in Rome, one in Ravenna, that completely rehabilitated Formosus. He declared the Cadaver Synod illegal and forbade any future trials of dead popes. But the chaos wasn't over. In 904, Pope Sergius III, a supporter of the Spoleto faction, took power and nullified everything Theodore II and John IX had done. Sergius reinstated the guilty verdict against Formosus and declared his ordinations invalid once again. The corpse of Formosus had now been declared guilty, innocent, and guilty again by 3 successive popes. The theological and political fallout was catastrophic. No one knew which priests were legitimate. No one knew whose authority was real. The church was eating itself alive. The Cadaver Synod remains one of the most bizarre and disturbing episodes in the history of the Catholic Church. It's often dismissed as the act of a madman, Pope Stephen VI driven insane by political pressure or personal vendetta. But recent historical scholarship suggests it was more calculated than that. Stephen wasn't crazy. He was desperate. In an age when power meant survival and weakness meant death, Stephen used a trial to prove his loyalty to the Spoleto faction and secure his position. It didn't work. What the Cadaver Synod revealed was the rot at the heart of the medieval papacy. This wasn't about theology or faith. It was about power, revenge, and political control. The trial wasn't just grotesque. It was a symbol of how far the church had fallen. As for Formosus, his body finally found peace. After being exhumed, tried, mutilated, thrown in a river, retrieved by fishermen, reburied, condemned again, and then rehabilitated once more, he was laid to rest in St. Peter's Basilica. He's still there today. In 897 AD, the Catholic Church put a dead man on trial for crimes he could not answer for. The corpse was found guilty. The judge was strangled in prison. And the church spent years trying to undo the damage. History remembers the Cadaver Synod not for its verdict, but for what it revealed. That even the sacred could be twisted into something monstrous when power was at stake.